Go on, scrunch up real small. Stop.
In the distant past, as video games had fully embraced 3D graphics, the humble 3D platformer was an industry staple. Previously, studios with aspirations to become mainstays may have created a 2D mascot platformer to capitalize on the popularity of the Super Mario and Sonic the Hedgehog games. With Mario's triumphant transition to 3D, the hopeful developers would try their hand at creating an adventure within this new dimension. Many would see success, but as the industry aged, so did the audience, and the demand for gritty and mature games rose. As the PlayStation 2 claimed enormous market share in the early 2000s, a number of developers would release their new, maturer IPs. Naughty Dog's Jak and Daxter, Insomniac's Ratchet and Clank, Argonauts' Malice, Double Fine's Psychonauts, Rare's Conker's Live and Reloaded. Amid this surge, a French racing game developer tossed their hat into the ring, and in 2003, Kaya Dark Lineage was released. With all of this competition, Eden Games were forced to innovate to have any chance of standing out. Kaya's identity had to be defined, and Eden were successful in many ways. Their contemporaries were including ranged weapons to reduce the beat-em-up combat's tendency to devolve into simply mashing attack buttons. There were vehicles, and more complex narratives too. Eden instead focused on creating a brawling combat system, refining the board riding mechanics, and creating enormous levels to explore. They didn't stray too far from their inspirations, however, and the game still features anthropomorphized animals as well as level themes that had been seen frequently already by this point. Kaya Dark Lineage would have to be something very special in order to hold a candle to its competitors. Throughout the course of the adventure, the player will guide Kaya throughout a handful of enormous levels, overcoming platforming challenges, battling Brazul's Wolfen army, riding her magical board, and falling through hazardous gauntlets. Kaya's movement speed is at an odd place, where it isn't quite fast enough, but if it were any faster, the player would lose some necessary precision during the more tight platforming sections. The running animation is likely the genesis of this impression, since Kaya is quite bouncy as she jogs around. The jump is adequate, and Kaya is able to hang from ledges to reach higher places, as well as traverse narrow pathways. Some portions of the levels are dedicated to traversal challenges, which can be either boarding or gliding. The boarding sections are initially quite fun. The player simply directs Kaya to move sideways or jump as she hurtles down the obstacle courses. Rarely, the player will have to slow down to avoid some hazards, but for the most part, these are fast-paced and enjoyable. Things change when the speed pads are introduced for a number of reasons. There isn't a lot of precision available when controlling the board, so being asked to hit small targets at high speed is a sudden demand for accuracy that the game hadn't asked for at all previously. Another issue is due to poor conveyance, which is such a huge issue that we'll get to it a little later on. The gliding sections are also entertaining and are fortunately free from any conveyance problems. Sometimes Kaya will be launched high into the air, and the player has to avoid terrain and other hazards while aiming for a pillowy mushroom plant, which is the only place Kaya can land safely. Other times there are a series of updrafts that the player can use to fly through gauntlets. While these are visually exciting, there are basically no consequences for taking damage, and the Flappy Bird controls made avoiding the damage zones seem more random than predictable. Some of these glide tunnels are also especially ugly, which is uncommon among the rest of the environments. Generally, Kaya Dark Lineage is a colourful experience. There's a cartoony style throughout the whole game that would be welcome on Nickelodeon at the time. All of the environments are vibrant and full of life, even the areas that are supposed to be desolate or destroyed. The world is a collection of floating islands with different environments depending on the level's theme. The roots, the native city, and the flying forest are three lush forested environments that lack much visual distinction but have defined mechanical purposes. The hunter's domain, the quarry, and the air post are all rocky regions with much clearer distinct elements. The Wolfen City is also similar in theme, but has a much more underground focus. And while it is rocky, the Forgotten Islands focus on lava makes it stand out against the other environments. Some of the visuals are poor by the standards at the time, but the bright colours keep the majority of the game's visuals palatable. Kaya's design is believable, if a little bland, and the other human character, Frank, is appropriately early 2000s looking. Brazil has a good cartoon villain look, and the Wolfen are great enemies. Brazil's bird is a tad over-designed when compared to everyone else, but at least it isn't a native. The native models are pretty horrific. The designs aren't all that appealing, but the execution is especially bad. Distinguishing between the relevant native characters is quite easy, since they're the most hideous of all of the models. The chief's mouth is just far too big, and his eyelids seem like they probably shouldn't exist. None of the other natives have eyelids, so it's strange that the chief does. The weapon tutor has dark, sunken eyes, and the boarding native wears a strange set of goggles. I much preferred the visual design of this game when the natives are never on screen. Even the goofy Yoshi creatures look better. I think it's important you understand just how bad the chief model looks. There are a handful of animated movies peppered throughout the game, which are disappointingly poor. There's something off about the lighting in most, and they are regularly buggy. They are also the places where the voice acting crops up, and it is rough. I had expected all of the voices to have been members of the development team because the performances are so amateur. But no, David Gassman plays the chief.
What's going on?
What have you done?
What you told me to do!
Never trust the bird, Kaya! Yeah!
This dude's been in everything. He was Goku and Rayman. He's been acting in games and animated shows since 1990. What the heck is this performance? Kaya is voiced by an amateur, but Andy Chase is in here, doing this.
Sick of walking all the time?
Huh?
Why don't you get a board or something?
Imagine doing these voices for an entire series. The production is good at least. You can hear the bad acting in excellent quality. The other sounds are also great, and while music seemed missing in some places, what is here is perfectly serviceable. Production value aside, the script and the game's overall tone fluctuate all over the place. I struggled to truly determine the target audience, as it doesn't seem to be consistent between the narrative side and the gameplay side. The narrative has a soft, episodic structure with elementary themes like don't be jealous and be okay with who you are, that heighten that Nickelodeon feeling. But then the player is thrust into a room with 12 enemies to battle at the same time, one of which is a mini-boss that's challenging enough alone. Andy hopes Kaya finds her brother, but doesn't tell the player what their actual objective is, or what resources they have access to now. The Wolfen fart and fight amongst themselves, and then Brazil calls Kaya a bastard. I guess that's how it got that 12 and up rating. Brazil's plan is actually quite diabolical, and Kaya's lack of remorse upon killing him is brutal, but certainly deserved. Late one night, Kaya's sleep is disturbed by a noise outside of her room. She's shown to reach for a boomerang when dealing with potential threats, as she stalks out to investigate. It turns out, Kaya's brother Frank drank too much Monster and punched a hole through a wall in their house, finding a room filled with strange artifacts. These items had been collected by Kaya's father, who mysteriously disappeared when she was young. One of the artifacts activate, and the pair are quickly transported to the other world. The pair landed separate places. Frank is quickly retrieved by the Wolfen, while Kaya is found by a group of natives. Wolfen quickly appear, and Kaya is urged to flee with the natives back to their city. Once there, the chief advises Kaya that she will have to fight the Wolfen to acquire pieces of a MacGuffin necessary for Kaya and Frank to return home. While she explores the levels and collects the pieces, Brazul had been finishing the work on his machine that transforms the natives into Wolfen. This machine is adapted to be able to transform humans into Wolfen, and it is even minimized to be small enough to be shoulder mounted. Kaya eventually learns how to reverse the transformation, since the magic used by the machine is similar to the magic used by the other human that traveled to the native city in the past. Brazul is Kaya's father, which isn't really treated as a revelation. It's so obvious that I definitely prefer it this way. As it happens, Brazul isn't actually a human, so Kaya is only half human, which is the entire basis behind the be proud of who you are substory, and kind of weak as a positive enforcement idea. As the player progresses, they defeat a few Wolfen encampments, rescue the named natives from capture, and even face off against a Wolfen Frank before fighting against Brazul himself atop a floating platform. Detailed boss encounters aren't usually something I like to discuss, because difficulty is subjective, and I generally seek to offer recommendations to play the games if I think that they're worthwhile. While my experience with Kaya Dark Lineage had many positives, I think that the bosses are so astonishing that I'm willing to forgo my hesitance and detail them all. Firstly, the large worm creature. There's no foreshadowing for this battle, and its location with the environment doesn't seem logically feasible. It's a worm. It has lava around the edges of the arena. It is fought at the top of a large tree. The worm will constantly shoot lava blobs at the player, which will remain on the ground if they miss. It has 6 weak points on its front that must be hit with the boomerang, which requires climbing the rock formations within the arena to get high enough to hit the higher weak points, like a crappy Zelda boss. While the worm is shooting, it is immune to attack. The boomerang is required to destroy the lava blobs in order to give the player space to move around, but on the rock formations, being comboed by the blob and the thorns is a particularly likely event. Not a great fight, and a horrible boss to have near the start of the game. Next is the Hunter. This enemy is briefly alluded to before meeting him, but he's the second boss, so he doesn't live up to the hype. The Hunter rides a skull hot air balloon that shoots 2 different types of bombs at the player. The first is an electric bomb that must be avoided, while the second is a timer bomb that is used to damage the boss. The player must kick the bombs back at the Hunter before they explode. There's a slight second phase. That means the player must hit the bomb with a boomerang when it is beside the Hunter, since he has moved away from the ground. This battle is underwhelming and disappointing. At one stage, the native city is attacked, and the named natives are whisked away in an airship. The player must mount a blue Yoshi creature to catch up to the airship, as it closely follows a cliff top. Beside it is a Wolfen tank that the player must operate to destroy cannons on the side of the airship, which allows Kaya to climb the broken gunport doors like a ladder to get onto the airship and free the natives. This encounter is horrendous. There isn't really a clue as to what the objective is when the player arrives here. It just starts. There's a timer and a blue Yoshi. Go. I tried destroying the airship with a cannon on the tank. There's no feedback that this is or isn't doing anything, but sometimes the bombs clip through the airship, so I figured there were weak spots I had to hit. I then tried destroying every single cannon that poked out of the gun ports. It was the only damage I could visibly see, so it seemed like the solution. The cannons follow a cycle, which means I would often be waiting for a single gun to poke out in order to test my theory that this was the solution. I then tried jumping from the Yoshi onto the gunport doors. The first time I tried this, I managed to miss or clip through. Climbable wall detection had been spotty up until this point, so this being a possible solution wasn't clear. A few attempts later, I managed to climb aboard, and there was no resistance. The airship was unoccupied. This encounter is awkward for so many reasons. The goal is unclear, jumping off of the Yoshi is tricky, sometimes the Wolfen or the cannon just wouldn't spawn on the tank, climbing up the airship seems wrong, and there not being a single wolfen operating the airship is very strange. Frank the wolfen is next. The player battles him in a similar way to how they fight the regular wolfen, but sometimes Frank will start casting a large AoE spell. The player has to run down one of the corridors attached to the arena, and hide in a hole at the end of the corridor to avoid this AoE attack. Then, Frank summons wheels with electricity flowing between them, and hurls them at the player as they make their way back to the arena. This boss isn't especially bad, but the AoE attack hallway thing is difficult to notice. The primary fight occurs in a circular arena, but whenever Frank starts charging up, the player has to run out of the arena and crouch in a hole. Nothing like this has been present in the game up until this point. The penultimate boss is the transformed native that found Kaya at the start of the game. His name is Aten, and this fight is preposterous. There are 3 varieties of wolfen enemies that appear throughout the game. There are the standard wolfen with all of their weapons, the big guys, which rarely have a club, and then the super wolfen, which I had considered mini-bosses up until this point. The super wolfen have a lot of health, they deal a lot of damage, can block from any side, and are immune to being jumped on, which was the only way I knew of that could break enemy blocks. I struggled with these guys. I did so little damage to them, and their attacks came out so quickly and did so much damage that if I could cheese them by knocking them off the platform I was fighting them on, I would. Aten is a stronger version of these guys. He is equipped with the shoulder-mounted transformation gun. If the player is hit by this, they instantly lose. The animation and the projectile aren't tied together overly well, so the charging animation will play, and then nothing will happen. Then, as the player moves into attack, they are hit by the projectile and lose. If the player makes it into melee range with Aten, he won't use the cannon, but if the gap gets wide enough, he will start shooting again. The Super Wolfen can block attacks from all sides, so getting behind them isn't overly important to the strategy of defeating them. The best way is to bait out a long string and then parry it. This leaves them vulnerable to attack. Aten can block while he is attacking, so I tried to cheese him. One of the boundaries of the arena is a lava river. I could simply bait him or continuously attack his block to get him near the lava, and then I could just knock him in. Actually, he's immune to the lava damage. If Kaya's shoes are covered by the lava, the player immediately loses. But Aten can stand in the lava, for no reason. He just can. I eventually managed to defeat him. It seems like his AI bugged out, and I managed to knock him over enough times to win. Finally, there is Brazul. He's basically a battle mage, so he's willing to enter hand-to-hand combat with Kaya, but he can also cast some spells. The melee spells are tough to read, but they're good attacks. They're fair, and they deal appropriate damage. Occasionally, Brazul will start flying and charging up lightning attacks. He can't be reached while flying, so the fight is kind of tedious. It is possible to knock him out of the air early by manually aiming a boomerang throw at him, but it isn't really worth doing. Just avoid the lightning P and wait for him to come back down. Beat him up, that's it, you win. This is a pretty poor showing. There's certainly a charm throughout the whole game, but the bosses are just dreadful. There's also a large number of polish problems that penetrate most aspects of Kaya Dark Lineage. Brazul's ice attack seems to have a much wider hitbox than the visual suggests, but it is also likely that the camera makes it difficult to tell relative positions of objects within an environment. The camera has a tether to Kaya that makes sure she is always on screen during gameplay, but it also has a collider, so the camera can never be pivoted through environment pieces. This affects combat and platforming sections negatively, since being able to see what's happening isn't the camera's objective. It's also strange there are 2D platforming sections that don't lock Kaya onto the 2D plane. She gains the ability to jump from walls quite early on, and it isn't uncommon to jump out of a 2D section or against the back wall of a 2D section and end up having to restart it. Having Kaya's Z-axis movements blocked during these actions would have been a simple solution to this. Another simple solution would have been to reduce how frequently enemies block. Fights can drag on for a long time if the player tries to aggress. This may have been an issue resolved by the combat tutor, but after the first time I was prompted to go there, I completely forgot that there was a combat tutor. I had found some combos that did consistently good damage by playing with the inputs, and figured that the upgraded bracelets were just damage increases. The game does next to nothing to inform the player of what they can do. In the map menu is a small white line of text that says the current objective. I didn't notice this until most of the way through the third level. I was standing at a crossroads. Both paths involved the board, but something seemed off about them. The left path was a large ramp, but I was too slow to make it to the top, and the right involved pressing a button to open a door, then riding the board through the door before it closed again. I was able to glitch through both paths into another section of the level where I would be promptly killed by the enemies. Early on, Kaya befriends a bat creature that allows other characters to telepathically communicate with Kaya, as well as provide the occasional gameplay tip. This bat never spoke up whenever I found myself at these dead ends. Oh, you need a faster board to go up that ramp. The player doesn't even receive upgrades as rewards for completing tasks. They need to transform a bunch of orphan back into natives so they can open a shop in Native City. Then the player can go to the shop and buy the upgrade. Whenever a milestone is reached, the bat could have commented that a new shop had opened, or just give the player the item as a reward. As far as bugs and glitches go, Dark Lineage isn't unacceptably broken, but there are little problems all over the place. Strange cutscene issues and the lack of knockback from static damage sources were the most common problems, but they don't really matter when compared to the final stretch of gameplay. Upon Aten's defeat, the volcano the fight had been occurring in becomes unstable. The lava begins to rise, and Brazil manages to collide his platform with some stalactites as he hurriedly makes his escape. The camera shifts back into gameplay mode, and Kaya is standing in the center of Aten's arena. It isn't possible to transform Aten, but that isn't the issue. Four enormous white stalactites fall into the ground in front of Kaya. They're white, almost textureless. They make no sounds, nor is there any kind of particle effect or screen shake as these enormous spikes slam into the ground and form a staircase for Kaya to begin her escape. There's no dramatic music playing here either. This is the game's Metroid set piece, and it's almost silent. Another stalactite silently destroys part of the pathway ahead, but it just replaces it anyway. There's some super uncomfortable boarding here, might be bugged, and it sadly displays exactly how the board mechanic works, as Kaya is able to slide slowly uphill, no problem. This escape sequence almost entirely undoes the most enjoyable mechanics of the entire game, and it ends on the platform with Brazil. What a bad taste to be left with. Normally, I can find a lot to love in these smaller games. Some amount of passion for the project seeps through and makes the whole experience worthwhile despite its shortcomings. I don't mind poor visuals, poor performance, bugs, or weak design. If an opportunity had been missed, that hurts. And Kaya Dark Lineage misses far more than I can forgive it for. Kaya could have teamed up with Jak or Rayman. Eden could have freed themselves from their singular racing series destiny. But instead, Kaya Dark Lineage's identity is defined by what it should have been, and not what it is. Speaking of Metroid moments, you'll never guess what I'm playing next.